Thank you all for coming. If I could, David Blaine's laughing. Please continue to eat. Welcome to NC Policy Watch Crucial Conversation Luncheon. I'm Chris Fitzsimons with NC Policy Watch. Before we get started, I want to we have one elected official in the audience, Representative Pricey Harrison, who just came in. Thank you for coming. Obviously, our thoughts are with the people in Charlotte today. It's a really tough time to be in North Carolina. Charlotte's my hometown. It's pretty stunning to watch that on the news, and I've been very sadly disappointed in some of our political leaders who are issuing statements just worrying about the law enforcement officers, which we all are, but there's a lot of other people, the family of Keith Scott, the people who have been living in fear for a long time, and the protesters down there. So let's keep them all in our thoughts and hope we have some peaceful resolution and some justice to the folks who live in Charlotte. But today we're here to talk about the election, and I was not surprised this morning to read online that Donald Trump's, one of his key coordinators in the key county in Ohio, declared today that there was no racism in America until Barack Obama got elected. So that was news to me. But we're here today to talk about what's actually going to happen in November. I can't think of anybody better to do that than our guest. And here to introduce Tom Jensen is Rob Schofield.
Thanks, Chris. Welcome all. Thanks for coming. I do want to introduce Tom Jensen to you, but before that, I also want to call your attention to 2 weeks from, it's yesterday, October 5th, our next Crucial Conversation Luncheon in this very venue. We're going to have Karen Hobart Flynn, who's the National President of Common Cause, which is very much, of course, involved in the whole gerrymandering debate, lots of the critical election issues that are afflicting our state and our nation right now. Karen's going to be a great guest, and I hope we'll be officially announcing that very shortly. Look for it on our website. We're sending out announcements, so add that to your calendars as well. That's Wednesday, October 5th. But today, of course, we're here to hear from a state treasurer, Tom Jensen, who is a nationally recognized pollster. I'm enough of a geek that sometimes when I walk at night, I listen to like podcasts on my phone, and one of them I sometimes listen to are the people at 538. I have mixed feelings about some of the stuff they say, but I was listening to them not that long ago, and it seemed like they spent half the time dissecting public policy polling and why they didn't like this or that. But obviously that's because they recognize that Tom, who is the genius behind public policy polling, is a formidable national force. He is and as for many of you, of course, who were here in January to hear his predictions of what would happen this year during the primary season and leading up to the November election, it's pretty much all come true. It's about just how he said it would happen. So we're obviously very interested to hear what he has to say today. Again, that's publicpolicypolling.com. I always remind everybody in the room at these events, we are a nonpartisan organization. I can probably guess how most of the people in this room and many of our guests watching online will vote in the election, but we are a nonpartisan. This is a C3 event, and so this isn't really an us versus them kind of a thing. It's an analysis event. But after Tom speaks, we will be happy to take your questions. I'll be trying to go around with a microphone to help you along. And thanks very much for joining us. So without further ado, please welcome Tom Jensen.
Well, thank you everybody for coming. You might have heard that we're a swing state in North Carolina this year. And what's interesting is that in both 2008 and 2012, North Carolina was the second closest state in the country for president. So being competitive is not a new development here. In 2008, as you all know, Barack Obama won the state by 14,000 votes. The only state that was closer was Missouri. In 2012, Mitt Romney won North Carolina by 2 points. The only state that was closer was Florida. So we certainly now for 3 cycles have been in this sort of situation of being about as close as we can be for president. But what's different this time is that we actually could determine who the next president is. In 2008 and 2012, North Carolina was icing on Barack Obama's cake. He was well past 270 electoral votes in terms of what he'd already won by wider margins before he got to North Carolina. So in 2008, it was a nice feather in his cap as part of a national landslide. In 2012, it was the one disappointment and an otherwise shiny election night. But the way things are shifting in different swing states around the country makes it so that this year, not only are we about as 50-50 as we could possibly be, but we also really have the potential to be the state that gives Hillary Clinton her 270th electoral vote, or gives Donald Trump his 270th electoral vote. And the reason that North Carolina has sort of moved up in the echelon of swing states is that the country as a whole is sort of, right now at least, if the election was today, is a little bit more Republican-leaning than it was in 2012. In 2012, Barack Obama won the popular vote nationally by 4 points. Right now, when you sort of look at the polls holistically, Hillary Clinton's up by somewhere between 1 and 3 points. So it's a little tighter than it was nationally 4 years ago. Doesn't mean it's going to be tighter once we actually get to November 8th, but all I can tell you is where we are right now. So it has gotten closer. Where a month ago Clinton was up by 4 to 6 points nationally, now it's down to 1 to 3. And polls are not, 100% precision thing. So if Clinton's up by 1 to 3, it's possible Trump could win by 1, and we just have to put that on the table. I don't think people should freak out about the election, but I don't think people should be complacent about it either. But anyway, when we talk about the country as a whole being right now a couple points more Republican than the 2012 results, that shift in a more Republican direction has not been evenly distributed nationally. Some states have shifted 5 or 6 points in a more Republican direction. Some states have actually shifted a couple points in a Democratic direction. It's not a uniform swing across the board. So let's talk about a few specific states. Ohio. Barack Obama won Ohio by 3 points in 2012, but right now Donald Trump's up by 2 or 3 points there when you look at the polls as a whole. So in Ohio, there's been a 5 or 6 point shift towards the Republicans. Iowa is a state that Barack Obama won by 5 points in 2012. This year, Trump's up by 4 or 5 points there when you look at the polls in the state as a whole. So that state's had more like a 8 or 9 point shift in a Republican direction. So those are a couple states that were stronger for Democrats in 2008 and 2012 than North Carolina, that this year are weaker than they were. North Carolina, on the other hand, we had the situation in 2012 where Mitt Romney won the state by 2 points. This year, when you look at all the polls all together, we are dead even. So while states like Ohio and Iowa and Michigan and Wisconsin and some of these other Midwestern states have been shifting in a more Republican direction, we in North Carolina have been shifting in a more Democratic direction. So that's why, whereas we were just icing on the cake in 2008 and 2012, this year, because North Carolina is a stronger state for Democrats than places like Ohio and Iowa that you much more traditionally sort of think of as being the key swing states, that's why we've moved up the echelon of swing states to where we're no longer the icing on the cake state. We have the potential to be the determinative state. So that's sort of the big picture of why we're so important in North Carolina this year. Some of the specifics of what we're finding in North Carolina right now. We did a brand new fresh poll Sunday through Tuesday for the purposes of this luncheon, so we have something as modern as possible in North Carolina. And what we found is that when you test Clinton, Trump, Gary Johnson, Donald Trump has a 2-point lead. And then we do a second question. We ask people who said they were for Gary Johnson or who said they were undecided, well, if you had to choose between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, who would you vote for? And when you do that, Clinton picks up a couple points and it's a tie. I actually think the two-way race is more predictive of what's going to end up happening than the race where you include everybody. Because what we find is that when the election's sort of further away, it's not that further away anymore, it's still got 47 more days, but given how long it's been going on, it's starting to feel close. But people who say that they're voting for a third-party candidate, that's often sort of their way of registering protest further out from the election, and then when it gets to actually be the election, they decide which of the two major candidates they hate least and vote for that person. Hillary Clinton's got the hate least vote. I don't know if that's something you want to write home about or not, but if it gets you to the White House, so much the better. And the other thing we find is that among people who are undecided in the race with all the candidates included, if you say, okay, you got to pick someone, they're much more likely to go to Clinton than they are to Trump. So right now, if you're a big poll junkie, you hear all the time about how the four-way polls are better for Trump, the two-way polls are better for Clinton. It's about a 2-point difference. I am inclined to think that the two-way is more indicative of where we might end up. So that means we're tied. We're tied in North Carolina, 47-47. And what's really interesting about the 6% of voters in North Carolina who remain undecided, and this is something that we're finding in North Carolina, and it's something that we're finding in all the swing states across the country, is that the undecideds are people who love Barack Obama's direction for the country, but they just don't like Hillary Clinton. And at this point, that's so much of a stumbling block to them that they just can't bring themselves to vote for her. So specifically on the North Carolina poll that we did earlier this week, we said to the we said it to everybody, but I'll focus on the undecideds. If you had a choice between continuing Barack Obama's presidency for another 4 years or making the wild shift to Donald Trump, that's not how we asked it in the question, characterization. Among the undecideds, 63% said they'd rather have 4 more years of Obama. 5% said they'd rather have Trump. So among those 6% of undecideds, there's a 58-point net advantage for continuing the current direction of the country rather than making the sharp pivot to Trump. But when you look at those undecideds, 75% of them have a negative opinion of Hillary Clinton. Only 10% of them see her positively. Now that's actually a lot better than Donald Trump. This is a sample of about 60 people. Literally not a single undecided voter in North Carolina has a positive opinion of Donald Trump, at least on this poll. Hillary Clinton's favorability with them was 10%. Donald Trump's favorability with them was 0, and that's not rounds down to 0, that's 0, 0. So my sense about these voters who remain undecided, first of all, if the people who say they want to continue Obama voted Clinton and the people who say they want to switch to Trump voted Trump, you'd end up with Hillary Clinton winning North Carolina 50-48. So if these folks can somehow be convinced to overcome their dislike of Hillary Clinton, whether it's for something to actually happen in the next 7 weeks that makes them like her, or for them to just grudgingly say, I'm never going to like her, but she's not nearly as bad as Trump, that flips North Carolina from being dead even to being a modest Democratic advantage. I think we're going to see a lot of Barack Obama in North Carolina over the next 7 weeks, because when you see that those undecided voters love him, love his direction, don't like Hillary Clinton, he's the best messenger that she has to try to get those folks off the fence and get them into her column. But that really is the state of things. We're tied. Our undecideds are people who are generally progressive leaning. They just really don't like the Democratic candidate for president. To give you another metric of just how evenly divided things are in North Carolina, Hillary Clinton's favorability in North Carolina is 40%. 55% of voters have a negative opinion of her. Donald Trump's favorability in North Carolina is 40%. 55% of voters have a negative opinion of him. Literally exactly the same. So they're tied head to head. They have the exact same favorability rating. We really are as close as we could possibly be. And that does mean that the difference maker could end up being the ground game, and which side does a better job of turning its people out to vote. So if you're here today, whether you be for Clinton or Trump, and you care about who wins this election, go volunteer, because I really think it's possible that North Carolina is going to end up getting decided by half a point or something like that. And that means that volunteer efforts really could make the difference in determining which way that half of a point goes. I'll tell you another interesting thing we found on this North Carolina poll is among Trump voters, we asked them, who do you like better, Hillary Clinton or David Duke? And they said by a 7-point margin that they like David Duke better than Hillary Clinton. I don't know why anyone might consider that to be deplorable. So that sort of shows you where some of that's coming from. Presidential race nationally, we actually came out of the field with a national poll last night for a client. I don't think this will be publicly released, so I'll let you in on the inside information. Clinton was up by 3 points, 45-42. So, there's a lot more undecided voters than there usually are this far out from the election. In 2012, a lot more people had already made up their minds than they have at this point, and that's sort of a function of the unpopularity of the candidates, but I think she does have a narrow advantage. It's not as great as it was a month ago, but that's kind of where we are. It's a tight race, could go either way, but Clinton is the favorite. So I'll move on to some state level stuff. HB2's been, oh, no, I want to make one more point about the Trump-Clinton thing. And this doesn't have anything to do with polling data necessarily, but when we released our North Carolina poll yesterday and it was tied, I had like a dozen Trump supporters across the country in my Twitter feed actively cheering the unrest in Charlotte because they thought that would help Trump win the state. I don't care what side you're on, rooting for people to get shot so that your preferred political candidate can win a state in the presidential election is just really disgusting. So that's what we get subjected to on Twitter on a day-to-day basis. And sometimes I just like people to know what's out there and what people are saying. That was pretty eye-opening to me that you would root for violence on the streets because you thought that it might help your candidate win. And I don't think it will help the candidate win anyway, but it's interesting. State level picture. HB2 obviously was in the news a lot last week. So when we did our North Carolina poll this weekend, we asked people, would you support or oppose repealing HB2? We didn't ask people, would you support or oppose Charlotte repealing its ordinance and then we repeal HB2? We just asked people if they support or oppose repealing HB2. That's the choice on the table. Only 32% of voters in the state said they thought we should keep HB2 on the books. 52% said they thought we should get rid of it. 20-point margin for getting rid of HB2. And when you think of it, some people say to me, well, I'm surprised it's not larger. Well, it's because we live in a little bit of a bubble. The triangle is certainly the epicenter of opposition to it. But it's also, you have to think about the fact that we are so evenly divided as a state when you look at just about anything, that for voters to want to get rid of a contentious piece of legislation by 20 points, that actually is kind of a landslide margin to want to get rid of it. Because we as a state are in a situation where we're so at odds with each other about everything that 20 points on something is actually quite substantial. So even if it seems like it should be larger, I think that is a significant finding. And one thing that was interesting about the opposition to HB2 and the desire to repeal it is we asked people, do you have a favorable or unfavorable opinion just generally of LGBT people? Because really the only purpose of HB2 is to target LGBT people, so we wanted to see just how many North Carolinians actually, dislike LGBT people. 19%. 19% of North Carolinians said they had a negative opinion of LGBT people. 47% positive. 34% said, I don't care. So that's a big part of why this bill is so unpopular. You're targeting a group that, it's disappointing that there's even 19% of North Carolinians who just straight up say, I hate the gays. But it still shows how out of touch the legislators and the governor are who put this into place when you see that those numbers are so low for actually having a negative opinion about a whole group of people such that you would want to target them with legislation and that kind of thing. So another thing that we've asked in all of our HB2 polling is, do you think HB2 has made the state safer or not? Since that's the whole purpose of it, it's supposed to make us safer. It's especially supposed to make you ladies safer. So I always, every single time that we poll on this, pick out the crosstabs among women because I just really want to know how safe women feel like HB2 is making them. And we found on this newest poll that 25% of women in North Carolina said HB2 was making them safer, 50% said it wasn't, and 25% said they weren't sure. And my feeling is that if you don't know that HB2 is making you safer, probably isn't. So 75% of women in North Carolina don't think HB2 is making them safer, but I guess that 75% must not talk to Dan Forrest very often because the women he knows seem to really think they need the protection, at least in his mind. We ask about the impacts on, various different levels. 60% of voters say it's having a negative impact on us economically. 55% say it's having a negative impact on our national reputation. Similar numbers, 55 to 60% saying it's having a negative impact overall. So there's really there's no doubt people don't like it. They want it repealed. They don't want to play games about repealing it. They just want to repeal it. And I'll tell you another person who HB2 is having a negative impact on is Pat McCrory. When we were here in January, and really, excuse me.
I said it couldn't happen to a nice guy.
When we were here in January, and really any time I talked about the governor's race for the last year and a half, I would have said, because this was the case, it's as 50-50 as it could possibly be. We've been pulling it every month for the last 20 months. Sometimes McCrory was up by 1 or 2 points. Sometimes Cooper was up by 1 or 2 points. Sometimes it was tied. But big picture, it was always tied. And so in something like 20 polls of the governor's race in North Carolina, I think we'd never found anyone with a lead larger than 3 points. Until this week. We have Roy Cooper now up by 5 points, 46 to 41. And then when you do the same thing like I was talking about in the presidential race, where you prod the undecideds and the people saying they're going to vote for the Libertarian and ask them who they're going to vote for, the 46 to 41 lead for Cooper goes up to 50 to 43. And there was also a New York Times poll this morning that came out with Cooper up 50 to 42. So, Civitas had McCrory up last week, but we're finding that generally if you're not on the Art Pope payroll, you find that Roy Cooper has now moved into a pretty clear lead. And HB2, I think, is the biggest reason for that. That's what turned this from a 50-50 race into a race where Cooper's the clear favorite. We asked people, does Pat McCrory's handling of HB2 make you more or less likely to vote for him, or does it not make a difference? People say by a 12-point margin that it makes them less likely to vote for him. That's something that wasn't on the table 6-7 months ago. That is now. That's caused that sort of dynamic in the race to shift. And when you just ask in general, do you approve or disapprove of how Pat McCrory's handled HB2, it's like 37% approve, 50% disapprove. So he's lost the voters on this. There's a couple, I should make a broader point about McCrory. Everybody in this room remembers the summer of 2013 and how out of control the legislature got. The greatest summer that brought the Moral Monday movement onto the stage and so strong. That was the positive outgrowth of it, that kind of thing. To national people looking in on North Carolina, HB2 is the only reason McCrory's in trouble. If not for that, he'd be fine. We've actually had McCrory with a negative approval rating now for 39 months in a row. His approval rating went negative in the July of 2013 when the General Assembly went crazy and he let them do it. And we asked people, who do you think's calling the shots in Raleigh, McCrory or the General Assembly? And they said the General Assembly. So they hate what the General Assembly's doing. They think McCrory's a weak leader who lets the General Assembly run roughshod over him. He's had a negative approval rating for 39 months going back to that kind of stuff. So he would have been in trouble, and a lot of trouble this year no matter what. I don't want it to get I don't want everything else that happened in the last 4 years to get lost in HB2, because there was a lot of stuff that had really antagonized voters already. So that's the piece on McCrory, negative approval for 39 months. A big thing that I talked about when I was here in January is how people just didn't know Roy Cooper, even after 16 years as Attorney General. Your average voter, that's not something you pay a lot of attention to. We generally found that about a quarter of voters said they had a positive opinion of him, a quarter of voters said they had a negative opinion of him, and about 50% said they had no opinion one way or the other. Obviously, over the course of the year, Cooper's been much more in the spotlight. He's had a chance to introduce himself to voters and for them to get a chance to know him, that kind of thing. And now we find that 40% of voters see him favorably, 32% unfavorably, 28% no opinion. So generally, as voters have gotten to know Cooper better, they like him. So it's partially that McCrory certainly is strongly disliked, but voters have taken a liking to Roy Cooper as they've gotten to know him better over the course of this year, and that's why he's positioned well, too. A couple of specific things within the numbers for governor that I kind of want to touch on about why things are going the way they're going. As you know, in 2012, Pat McCrory didn't just win, but he won by 12 points. It really was an impressive-sized victory. And the reason that McCrory won by 12 points in 2012 was because he won independent voters 2-1. Usually expect independent voters to be pretty evenly divided or have a slight lean to the Republicans, that kind of thing. McCrory won like 70% of the independents in 2012, so that's why he not only won, but won by 12 points. He's totally turned off those voters. And the poll that we just got out of the field with Cooper was leading with independents by 11 points. So that's basically a 50-point shift among independents over 4 years, from McCrory winning them by about 40 to Cooper being up by about 10 with them. And what's really interesting is that we generally find that independents in North Carolina are voting for Trump. They are so disgusted with McCrory that you actually have people voting the improbable ticket of Trump Cooper. So that's what we're seeing with independents. I know that's like kind of surprising and weird, but we have people doing that, I guess, because they're just disgusted with everybody, so they see Clinton and McCrory as the incumbents and just throw them both out. Geographically, though, and I know that most of you probably live in Wake County, so I really want to emphasize this. The reason that the presidential race is so competitive, the reason that Roy Cooper's in such a good position, is largely due to shifts among voters in Wake and Mecklenburg counties. There's a lot of legislative districts in Wake and Mecklenburg counties that voted for Mitt Romney in 2012 by 5 or 10 points, where our polling this year has found that Hillary Clinton's up by 5 or 10 points. And this is something we're seeing across the country, is that suburban voters really do not care for Donald Trump. So like we go and poll the suburbs of Columbus, Ohio, same kind of thing that I'm talking about in Charlotte and Raleigh, where these districts that went narrowly Republican last time have flipped the other direction to Clinton this time. So that's one piece of what's going on. But then the second piece of what's going on is, you know, statewide HBC2 is opposed by 15, 20 points. In places like Wake and Mecklenburg County, it's opposed by like 30 or 40 points. And what's really interesting is that McCrory, especially in Mecklenburg County, but in Wake County too, won a lot of these suburban legislative districts by 25 or 30 points in 2012, because he was seen as being sort of the modern candidate. You have a lot of voters in these places who are newer to the state. Voters are very disproportionately unaffiliated. So you had a lot of people in places like Cary and Lake Norman, those kind of things, voting Obama and McCrory in 2012. And McCrory did very well in those districts, won them by 20, 30, that kind of thing. He is losing many of those districts now, and in some cases losing those districts by 5 or 10 points. So overall, the statewide shift from McCrory to Cooper is somewhere in the 15 to 20 point range from 2012. But in a lot of legislative districts here in Wake County and in Mecklenburg County, it's like a 40 or 50 point shift, and that's where the difference from 2012 is really occurring. And if Hillary Clinton's going to win, if Roy Cooper's going to win in North Carolina, it's really going to require winning places like Wake County by a very substantial margin. So sort of to segue from the governor's race into the legislature, what we find right now is that if the election for the legislature was today, 45% of voters statewide say they'd vote Democratic, 43% say they'd vote Republican. You would think with a 2-point Democratic advantage, if we lived in a real democracy, that would mean that Democrats had a chance at getting control of the state house or Senate. We all know better than that. What we have found, Todd Barlow, I think, helped me figure this out, is that Democrats would have to win the statewide legislative ballot by about 15 points to get control of either the state house or Senate. So that's about as rigged a playing field as you can possibly have, where one party would have to win by 15 points statewide to get control, which frankly, no party is ever going to win North Carolina by 15 points in the foreseeable future. Unless one party got control of president and Congress and started like mass executions or something. That's the only way I can see this state, which is so evenly divided, going that strongly one direction or another. So, one quick aside I'll make is that 63% of voters statewide support nonpartisan redistricting. Only 7% are opposed to it. So that's something where if the people had any control over it, we definitely would get the gerrymandering business out of the game, because the public does not think this is a good system at all. But with Democrats having a 2-point advantage statewide, what that means is you probably pick up some seats, but you certainly don't get anywhere close to a majority in the House or Senate. I do think Democrats have a very good chance at getting rid of the Republican supermajority in the House. So maybe our sort of best case scenario for state government next year is Roy Cooper's governor, he can veto everything, and then the Democrats in the House have enough people to keep his vetoes going, and we can just have a state government that does nothing. And I'm sure to many people here that would be an improvement on what we've had for the last 4 years. But what's really interesting is, again, talking about the sort of two-headed shift that we've seen in Wake and Mecklenburg County, where voters in these suburban districts hate Trump and they also hate HB2. That's bringing a lot of those legislative seats onto the map. And frankly, in some of these cases, legislative seats that weren't really on the radar in 2012 or 2014, but because of this combination of antagonizing activities have made them competitive. So I think if I had to predict like 2 districts that are definitely going to go Democratic this fall, it would be Gary Pendleton's district in Wake County, and then Charles Jeter's old district in Mecklenburg County. I both think are very good chances of moving Democratic. In Wake County, people in trouble, and I may forget a name, and if I forget a very obvious name, people in the know correct me, but there's certainly a chance Nelson Dollar could lose, that Chris Malone could lose, that Marilyn Avila could lose, that Rob Bryan in Mecklenburg County could lose, that John Bradford in Mecklenburg County could lose. So all those districts I think are going to be close. They could go either way, but a lot of those are places that weren't even being talked about as competitive races the last couple election cycles, and now they're very much on the table because of the unhappiness over some of these things going on. So, I think that there's a lot of different paths to getting up to 49 seats or more for Democrats in the House, and we'll just see how those individual districts play out. Obviously, it's a situation where voters aren't that familiar with the specific candidates yet. So the way that they're saying they're voting right now is sort of based on their overall mood towards the presidential race, the governor's race, HB2, that kind of thing. Maybe the Republican incumbents will be able to, get voters to see them differently than they see sort of the overall deal and do better. But certainly a lot of opportunities for some seats to shift parties in those places. Senate race in North Carolina. There's been, I think, 7 polls in the month of September. 3 of them Richard Burr was up in, 3 of them Deborah Ross was up in, and ours that we released yesterday was dead even at 41%. So I think this is a race that at the start of the year people didn't necessarily expect to be that competitive, but it's really become a top-tier swing state Senate race, and the greatest sign of that is that it's really been relatively close all year. After the primary, we were generally finding Burr with a 3 or 4 point lead over Deborah Ross, and it was curious because the race was so close. There kept being no national investment, no national investment, no national investment. And now finally in September, the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committees decided to put at least $6 million into North Carolina. So that's the sort of sign that it's officially a top-tier competitive Senate race now that really could go either way. And the reason that we're sort of in that situation is because even though he's been in the Senate for 11 years, even though he's been in Congress for 21 years now, North Carolinians just don't know Richard Burr very well. They don't dislike him, they just don't like him either. They don't know who he is. So we find it's really about a dead even 3-way split. 34% of voters in the state approve of Burr, 34% disapprove. and 32% have no opinion about him one way or the other. So when you're sort of that undefined in voters' minds, it leaves you prone to vulnerability. And I think, which none of us who have been around North Carolina politics for a long time will be that surprised by, but I think Deborah Ross has proven to be a very strong candidate and probably better than the experts in Washington, D.C. Expected her to be as a candidate. And one sort of piece of hard data that we saw in that direction was the results of the primary. Richard Burr, had a primary running for his third term, and he got like 61% of the vote. Deborah Ross, running statewide for the first time, introducing herself to most voters across the state for the first time, got closer to 70% of the vote in her primary. So that, to me, when we talk about this being a close race, that's a piece of real hard data that sort of confirms to me that we shouldn't be that surprised it's that close, that she, as a first-time statewide candidate, did such a better job in her primary than Burr did as a three-term incumbent. It showed that she was maybe a little stronger than people realized, that Burr was is maybe a little bit weaker than people realize. So it's a real 50-50 race. And what's interesting about sort of combining two threads of what I just talked about, Burr's anonymity and all of that Democratic money coming on down from Washington, is talking about a senator who voters are divided three ways in their feelings about sounds very familiar to me, because if we'd been standing up here talking 3 years ago, that's exactly what I would have said about Kay Hagan. Is that about a third of voters like her, about a third dislike her, about a third have no opinion about her one way or the other. Well, Republicans came in a whole year before the election in that case and just blitzed her with negative ads in November. So October 13, she's at 33, 33, 33. By the time we get to December of 2013, she's at 33 approve still. She's up to 50 disapprove, 17 no opinion. So half of the no opinion moved to negative, and she never overcame that. It never changed. Like, even though she still almost won because voters dislike Tillis so much too, she never overcame the fact that voters didn't really know who she was, and then once she got defined, it was the Republicans who defined her, and that was that. Burr is at risk of the same kind of thing happening to him, because it's the same situation where you have that third of voters on the fence, you have significant national investment coming in. I don't know if it'll be as effective as the Republicans were against Hagan in 2014 or as the Democrats were against Dole in 2008, but the sort of baseline circumstances are quite similar. And if you all didn't see it, the New York Times poll that came out this morning that I referenced has Ross leading by 4 over Richard Burr. I don't think the situation's that sunny, but it definitely shows that it's a possibility that could shift. And the battle for the Senate nationally is going to be very close in terms of who's able to get control or not. Democrats are almost definitely going to defeat the Republican incumbent Senate candidates in Illinois and Wisconsin, so those are sort of the safe pickups. But then you have North Carolina, Pennsylvania, New Hampshire, Missouri, Florida. I'm probably forgetting some, but lots of races that are sort of in that toss-up category. And there's a very good chance that you're going to end up with a 50-50 Senate or a Senate that's 51-49 one way or the other. So I talked earlier about how we might be the state that determines the presidential race. We might also be the state that determines who has control of the Senate or not, because it is quite possible that Deborah Ross is the difference between Democrats having 49 and 50 or 50 and 51 seats in the Senate and that kind of thing. And another thing that's a testament to what a strong candidate Ross has turned out to be is that one state I didn't just mention on that list of toss-ups is Ohio. And in Ohio, the Democratic candidate for Senate is a former Democratic governor. Here we have just a former state representative, but in Ohio, the former governor is losing by 10 or 15 points, and that seat's basically off the map. for Democrats, whereas here Ross has proved to be considerably more resilient. So we're getting Ohio's money now. After all those years, of Ohio being the biggest swing state in the country and North Carolina, either getting completely ignored or being a second-class citizen this year, we're getting Ohio's money. So that's definitely a sort of big shift in how these things go. Just going to run through a few quick hits on things we found in polls lately that I think you might find interesting. One thing that I find very interesting, and it's not getting any attention, and the fact that it's not getting attention is very telling in and of itself, but we're now finding both nationally and when we poll on a swing state by swing state basis that voters actually like Obamacare now. Remember how much we used to hear about it when voters didn't like Obamacare? I mean, every time there was a new poll, voters hate Obamacare, da 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 da. Now we find that like 40, it's not like overwhelmingly popular, but we find now that something like 46% of voters nationally support it. 39 or 40 oppose it. You don't hear anything about that like you used to hear about the bad polls. But what the supporters of Obamacare always said, and it's proven to be true, is they said once people really see how it works, they're going to end up thinking it's just fine. And once people who don't have insurance start getting insurance, and people who know people who don't have insurance start getting insurance, that's going to move the numbers. And that really is what's happened. And one thing that's particularly telling in those numbers is that we've seen Republican opposition to it decline. It's still like 70% opposed, but it was like 90% opposed, and that 20% gap, I think, is people who benefited from it. And we now see that Democrats like Obamacare more than Republicans dislike it, which is a very different situation than we used to see. A few other issues, and I'll just sort of talk about these generically because what I'm saying is true in both North Carolina and nationally. About 75% of voters want the minimum wage increased to at least $10 an hour. People are fine with, I think there's a lot of support for moving up to 12 or 15 over time, but immediately going up at least to $10 an hour from where it is right now. 75% of voters nationally support that. It's just an issue that almost nobody disagrees about, and it's something where we see even about 60% of Republicans now at least think we should increase the minimum wage to $10 an hour. Supreme Court vacancy, about 65% of voters think that we should be moving Merrick Garland's nomination forward. Only 25% support the current obstruction. Doesn't necessarily mean they think that Garland should be approved, but it means they think he should at least get a hearing, at least get a chance, that we shouldn't just have obstructionism. One thing that was really interesting is, early March, it was still unclear who the Republican candidate for president was going to be. We did a poll nationally about moving Garland's nomination forward, and 40% of Republicans said that they thought we should move Garland's nomination forward. And then a couple months later, right after Trump clinched the Republican nomination, we did another poll. And once it was clear Trump was the nominee, the percentage of Republicans who wanted Garland to go ahead and get confirmed went from 40% up to 60%. So I think the Kasich and Rubio supporters of the world said, okay, let's get on with this thing now. Another thing that's interesting is just what a total unifier basic gun control measures are. We find that 85 to 90% of voters support background checks on all gun purchases. 85 to 90% of voters support barring those on the terror watch list from buying guns. But what I found really interesting in our national polling lately is about 55 to 60% of voters nationally support an assault weapons ban. So that's a much more contentious, I think clearly based on the poll numbers, voters see background check, terror watch list as just like very obvious things that should be done, even though they're not being done. But even now on assault weapons, there's a very clear national majority in support of that. And one point that's been made in this election that I think is very interesting is that progressives are much more comfortable talking about and running on gun control now than they have been in the last 5 to 10 years. And I think or 20, 30 years really. And I think the reason for that is that even if it's not necessarily reflected in what we're seeing in legislation, the sort of battle in the court of public opinion has definitely gone towards the side of gun control advocates, and that's why you see candidates instead of sort of dodging and running away from that issue. In some cases, directly talking about it in a way that we haven't before. So I think I've gone on long enough, and I'll take your questions.
Thank you very much. I get to ask the first question, which is any insights on either council of state or congressional seats, anything of note standing out in any of those races?
Yeah, well, Council of State, we really are seeing a similar picture to what we are with sort of the other major races, which is that things for the most part are close. Lieutenant governor's race is a 3-point race. State treasurer is a 1-point race. Attorney general is a 4-point race. The only people with sort of clear leads in their races are Elaine Marshall and June Atkinson on the Democratic side have pretty big leads. Steve Troxler on the Republican side has a pretty big lead for Agriculture Commissioner, but even folks like Cherie Berry, Wayne Goodwin, who have been around for a while, are in like 4 or 5-point races. It's not like they're necessarily in huge peril, but they're sort of in the realm of competitiveness. And another statewide race I know a lot of you all are interested in is the Supreme Court race, but I can't tell you anything very helpful about that. 24% of voters are for Edmonds, 24% are for Morgan, and 52% are undecided, which is just the simple reality of what happens when you have a nonpartisan judicial race. And those of you who have been coming to these luncheons over the last 10 years or so have probably heard this anecdote enough, but I'll give it again, which is the last time that Bob Edmonds was on the ballot in 2008, his opponent was Suzanne Reynolds, and we did a poll the very last weekend before the election, and we broke it down by whether you'd already voted or not, or whether you were planning to vote on election day. In the Supreme Court race, 31% of voters were undecided among those who had already voted. And what's interesting about that is it's not like 31% of them had not voted in the Supreme Court race. The drop-off was only like 5 or 10% or something like that, but they'd already forgotten who they voted for. Which actually is a very teachable moment. Paula Wolf should interrupt me if you think anything I'm saying is wrong or you want to add to anything I say, because she's such a master at these judicial elections. But I think that one of the absolute biggest factors is just which side has more people at friendly polling places handing out pieces of paper saying who their preferred candidate is. For Michael Morgan to get elected to the Supreme Court really may come down to level of coverage at Wake, Durham, and Orange County polling places by people handing out sample ballots and that kind of thing, because that is how people figure out who to vote for, and that's why when you ask them 3 days later who they voted for, they already don't remember. But that sort of grassroots stuff goes so far in these races where voters just don't have any clue whatsoever. Do you want to
By
add
the
anything?
time it's we're passing things out on election day, she's a Democrat. She's a Democrat. Because people want to know.
Yeah, that's all they care about. So whichever side does a better job of getting that message out to the correct voters tends to be who wins.
You had said that there's 6% of the folks who are undecided that love Obama but distrust Hillary. Do you have demographics on who those people are?
Yeah, it skews very heavily young, for one thing. That is a big part of why Hillary Clinton is not doing as well as Barack Obama, is that among voters under 30, Barack Obama won them by about 30 points in 2008, won them by about 20 points in 2012. I think on this North Carolina poll this week, we had Hillary up by only 6 or 7 points among voters under 30. And it's not because very many of them support Trump necessarily, but the support for Gary Johnson in North Carolina and for both Gary Johnson and Jill Stein nationally is coming very disproportionately from younger voters. And then you also just have a lot of younger voters who are undecided more so than other groups. Now, when we do that thing I was talking about where you then ask them a follow-up, well, you really got to just tell me if you had to vote for Clinton or Trump, who would you go for? Then there's a lot more movement towards Clinton, but it's very reluctant support. So that's the single biggest group that's sort of in the undecideds who like Obama and don't like Hillary group is the younger voters. But there's also a decent African-American contingent to that in North Carolina. We found on this poll that Hillary was winning African-American voters 78-9 in North Carolina, which is pretty good, but you want that to be like 95-5 if you're going to win statewide as a Democrat in North Carolina. So again, it's not that so many African American voters are supporting Trump. There's just a lot still on the fence, and we'll see if she can win him over or not.
I'd like you to speak to Dan Blue's percentage points. And secondly, what do you see as the impact of Trump's aggressiveness and so forth for the upcoming debate?
In terms of Dan Blue III's race for treasurer, I think our poll this week found him up 38 to 37. So it's a close race, and it's a race with a lot of voters on the fence, which is not surprising in a council state race because voters just don't pay terribly close attention to that. So again, a lot of those council state races, it may be that all those toss-up races, they all end up going the same way by a couple points one way or the other, because there's just not going to be, because those races have so much trouble breaking through, there's not going to be a lot of people who vote for Dale Falwell but then vote for Josh Stein, or vote for Dan Forrest but then vote for Dan Blue III, that kind of thing. People are going to vote pretty much the same way for all of those, so they may all go one way or the other. The debate's going to be very interesting. This is sort of me putting on the pundit hat more so than the pollster hat, but I think what we're going to see Monday is probably that Hillary Clinton is much better prepared than Donald Trump is, and I would imagine that they've been practicing things she can say that will make him go, you all filled in the blanks for me. Like we know, I've seen reports this week in the media that they've gone back and watched all the Republican debates last year, very closely to see what got Trump to sort of go off the deep end. And we know that Clinton will have that kind of preparation. I don't know if Trump will have that kind of preparation. So it'll be very interesting to see.
There are about 20 hands up. I'm going to go to Eunice first.
Mine is a suggestion. Being from Ohio, and I was there over the Labor Day weekend, most of the people there are waiting on Barack Obama and Michelle, and that's who's going to change everything there.
Yeah, I totally agree with you about that. I think that the best allies that Hillary Clinton has over the next 7 weeks are Barack and Michelle out on the campaign trail, making the case for her to voters who are inclined in a progressive direction but just don't like her. If they believe that Barack and Michelle really like Hillary, and that's one thing, this is again me just talking like more as a person than a pollster, but you can tell when President Obama's been out on the campaign trail for Hillary that he means it, that he actually really wants to be out there. He's not out there going through the motions, doing it because that's what he has to do. And I think as he does that much more actively, there have been reports now that maybe he's going to start doing several events a week the rest of the way. You can read the body language, you can read the face. It's not just in what he says and that kind of thing. And I think his enthusiasm for her is the kind of thing that could move the race 1 or 2 points, and that might flip a state like Ohio. It might be the difference between losing it by 1 and winning it by 1. So I agree with you.
Is there a next question?
So you talked a little bit about the divide between urban and rural in North Carolina. It's becoming a huge issue statewide, and I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about that, especially as we look at statewide races and national races.
Yeah, it's definitely fascinating when we go through and do like individual legislative district polls this year. The first big batch of legislative polls that we did in the spring was mostly in Wake and Mecklenburg counties, and when Hillary was outperforming how Barack Obama did in those districts by such a wide margin, it was making me question our statewide polls. Like, if Hillary's doing 10, 15 points better in all these places, why isn't she up by 6 or 7 statewide? Well, now as the election's gotten closer, I've started doing legislative district polls in places like Harnett County and Burke County and those kinds of places. And in those areas that are more rural, Trump is actually doing at least as well as Romney did, if not better. Like places in some of the sort of mountain districts that are more Republican leaning, you'll see in a district that Romney won by 20, so it's already a Republican area though, but that now Trump's winning it by 25 or 30, because Trump is, for rural voters, generally white, often unhappy with the direction that the country's going, Trump is speaking their language to a much greater extent than Romney ever did. So that's why you see that kind of thing. So I think it is very important to sort of realize that the reason that we're in the same place overall pretty much compared to where we were 4 years ago is because the urban areas are moving much more Democratic, but the rural areas are moving much more Republican in a way that those two factors kind of balance each other out. Long term, probably good news for Democrats because the share of the vote in the state that's urban compared to rural is ticking up so much, but it's going to be close this year.
Seems to me Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, they seem to me to be as important as North Carolina. I guess you could probably give me that too. So if you could talk about those, that would be great. The second is a theory question, more pollster theory. So how, the most important thing to me, seems to me, about polls is how they decide what the electorate is going to look like. So, how do you decide whether it's going to look like 2012 or 2004, for example? That's all.
Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin are definitely an interesting set of states because they're places that Barack Obama won pretty handily. He won Pennsylvania by 5 points in 2012, he won Wisconsin by 7 points, and he won Michigan by 8 points. And these are states that Democrats generally feel like they can count on in the presidential race. But this year the race is closer in those places, whereas 5, 7, 8 last time around. This time Hillary Clinton is certainly winning in those states, but it's by more like 3 or 4 points. If it actually gets to the point where Trump can win places like Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, he's probably going to win the election, quite frankly. So it's something that sort of people need to keep an eye on, is that even though Clinton is favored in those states, they are not quite as safe as they were 4 years ago. But again, what makes North Carolina interesting is if the bottom, I don't anticipate this happening, but it's possible, is that the bottom could fall out on Clinton in the Midwest, but if she still won North Carolina and Florida, she still might have a path to 270 electoral votes. And I think long term, the path to the White House, which we always think of as being so much more of a Midwestern thing, is going to shift towards very much being a Southern thing. Virginia and North Carolina obviously are already very much on the swing state list. What's been interesting when we've polled in Georgia, South Carolina, and Texas this year is we have found in Georgia, South Carolina, and Texas that Democrats have a substantial advantage among voters under 45. The reason that they're still thought of as pretty strongly Republican states is because the seniors in those states are voting for Republicans by 30 points. And the margin among seniors is so great that it offsets the advantage that Democrats have with voters under 45. But you see the direction that's going. I would not be surprised if 2028, 2032, what used to be, we talked about Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, Iowa all the time, turns into we talk about North Carolina, Florida, Virginia, South Carolina maybe, Texas maybe, longer term. So that was an aside on that. Weighting definitely is sort of the biggest factor now in determining whether polls end up being right or wrong. And you have to base it on a combination of factors, which groups are most excited about the election, how the population has sort of shifted since the last election, and you can base that partially on census numbers. So it is a combination of sort of measuring enthusiasm, who's interested in the election, how has the population shifted. One thing that's interesting in North Carolina is every single election we have, we're going to have the least white electorate we've ever had in the history of North Carolina because the Latino population is ticking up, African Americans are either staying steady or ticking up, and white voters as a function of the overall population are declining. So in 2004, about 78% of voters in North Carolina were white. This year it's likely to only be 70 or 71%. And when you think about the fact that white voters in North Carolina are Republican by 30 points, non-white voters in North Carolina are Democratic by about 70 points, you have a situation where it makes a 9-point difference on the electorate just based on the demographic shift from 2004 to 2016. So John Kerry lost North Carolina to George W. Bush by 12 points in 2004. And just based on how our racial demographics have changed within the electorate over the last 12 years, you would expect that to shift to only losing by 3 points compared to 12 points. So you have a 9-point boost based on demographics and then try to make up the other 4 points with campaigning.
Considering the low approval rate of the two candidates, how do you think that's going to affect turnout, increased, decreased?
It's going to be very interesting to see, and I think it's still hard to say. One thing that's interesting in North Carolina is based on the absentee requests that have already come in compared to the similar point in 2012, the numbers are stronger for Democrats relative to Republicans than they were last time around. And I don't know if that's a function of enthusiasm or organization, but it's sort of an interesting data point. My sense is that in the end, turnout as a percentage will be pretty similar to what it was in 2012. Obviously, loving a candidate can be a motivator, but hating a candidate can be a motivator too. So, what you may see is in the exit polls, whereas maybe 90% of voters in 2012 said they were excited about who they voted for. This year it might be like 70 or 75%, but the dislike of the other candidate might be strong enough to get them out to vote whether they're excited about who they're actually voting for or not. One thing we've seen in Clinton and Trump's favorability numbers that's interesting is only about 80% of Democrats actually like Clinton. Only about 75% of Republicans actually like Trump. But when you ask Republicans how they feel about Clinton, 95% of them say they don't like her. When you ask Democrats how they feel about Trump, 90% of them say they don't like him. So there's a significant cohort of voters that's not thrilled about their candidate, but they'll come out and vote because they dislike the other guy so much.
I'm working for John McNeil this cycle, so how is he doing? How's George Holding doing?
Well, I think that in some of the congressional districts that are more suburban, urban kind of areas like Congressional District 2, you have maybe races that are not necessarily toss-ups, but are closer than they have been in previous election cycles, that you'll have a race that's in single digits instead of having a race that you've been accustomed to that's in double digits and that kind of thing. So, I mean, if I have to be real honest, I think it's unlikely that any congressional seats are actually going to shift, but I think the groundwork may be laid for some of those districts to be more competitive this year than they have been. And what we saw, for instance, in 2006 in North Carolina Congressional District 8 was a district that was not on anybody's radar screen, and Larry Kissel ran a strong campaign and ended up coming close and then came back and finished it off the next time around.
Does your polling give you a basis for having an opinion on the impact of Citizens United? And is that an issue that the public is aware of?
Sure. It's something where if you ask the public about Citizens United like that, for the most part, people are just going to draw a blank. When you talk about the impact that the proliferation of money is having on the electoral system and that kind of thing, voters are very unhappy about it. And it's interesting, Montana, which we don't think of as the most progressive state in the country, had like a non-binding resolution on the ballot in 2012 to throw out Citizens United, and it passed by 20 points. It was incredibly popular. So it's something where the more voters are aware about it and think about it, the unhappier they are, but it's not necessarily a top-of-mind issue.
That seems like a fitting conclusion maybe to our event here, to say that when voters are better informed, maybe get better results. So I hope you guys
so go out and work.
Take that to heart in the coming weeks. And again, join me in thanking Tom for a wonderful